Jules from Tarot Adventures with Jules. I am here today to chat with Ashley Stinson, the creator of the Energy Archaeology Oracle. I am super excited to speak with Ashley today. This deck is really fabulous. It's looking at the wisdom that you hold in your bones. One of the lines from the back of Ashley's guidebook is breathe in the wisdom of your body, let it settle in your marrow. And I love that so much. So I'm just going to grab Ashley. Ashley, hi, how are you?
Hello, how are you? Let me adjust.
Excellent.
There we go.
See here. It's a little bit, okay, I'm just gonna go up a little bit. There we go, better. How's your morning going?
It's going really well. Yeah, I mean, as we spoke, I have a kid-free week right now, so it's sort of like, what do I do with my entire morning?
I know, footloose and fancy free, hey? Like, it's amazing the difference. Like, I was just traveling with my eldest recently, and it was so strange to just be with one kid instead of three, right? Like, I mean, it was strange because I kept kind of keeping an eye out for the other two. I was like, where are they? And I'm like, oh, yeah, they're back in Nova Scotia, and I'm in Alberta or British Columbia. And it was like, we went, oh my gosh, it was so funny. We went for lunch in downtown Calgary. And we ordered all these dim sum items, and part of it was that we don't have access to like vegetarian dim sum very often, so we wanted to try all the things. And I wasn't expecting it to be like a huge plate of everything, but we also ordered as though there were 5 of us there. So because all this food kept coming, and I was just like, oh my goodness, like we're missing a few key people. So it's like breakfast for me, yay, you know, like that's awesome. So what did you do with your free morning?
Oh gosh, well, I've had a sick puppy for 2 days, so she's just not feeling better. So she got a lot of attention this morning.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of puppy cuddles and stuff, but otherwise, I took a walk. I actually did some painting on the outside of our house that needed to be done. It's just
Wow.
been, yeah.
Awesome. Oh, that's so sweet. So what breed of puppy do you have?
She's a mini she. Hold on, she just came out. It's this teddy bear.
Oh, what a sweetheart. Oh my goodness.
He's feeling
We
better.
have a little Chihuahua fox terrier. I think he's upstairs with my husband right now, but he's little. He's like 8 pounds soaking wet. So big size. But yeah, oh, what a sweetheart. I'm sorry that they're not feeling well. That's really tough.
Oh, it's okay. She'll rebound. She's
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to chat with you about your fabulous deck. I was just doing a little intro and reading the phrase that you have on the back of the guidebook, breathe in the wisdom of your bones, let it settle in your marrow. I love that so much. And I'm relatively new to this deck. It was a gift from my family for my birthday, so just a month ago. So I'm just starting to dip my toes in, and it's so incredible to start looking at the system that you've created with this. And I guess the first thing I wanted to ask is like, what led to the creation of the energy archaeology? Because it's a whole system,
yes.
right? And a process of exploration. So what was that journey like for you, like creating this whole infrastructure?
Harrowing? Is that a good enough word for it?
I bet. Yeah. No big deal. Like just create an entire system. That's, no biggie.
No, it's been really interesting. And it started, my kids will be 9, so it started about 7 years ago.
Okay.
And was part of my own introduction into, like, I didn't grow up with energy work or that being like a normal part of how you communicate with your body or how your body even heals, right? I was in a very Western medicine family.
Mm-hmm.
And had quite a traumatic birth with my twins. And my boss at the time, I was a landscape architect, is Korean. And he was like, have you ever tried Reiki? He's like, I go to an acupuncturist, I see a Reiki master, and I was like, I have not. Can I have their name?
Yeah.
And started going and getting Reiki treatment done as part of my own healing process. And every time I would lay on the table, this woman would tell me, like, you were meant to be doing this. She was like, there's like, she's like, I can feel it inside you. You were meant to be doing this. And so I trained with the woman who trained her, had a wonderful mentor. And whenever I was going through this process of learning Reiki and receiving the attunements, I was seeing very different things than she was explaining, or like saying that like she could see, or that maybe I should be able to see. And it was this kind of really destabilizing moment of being like, what do you mean I'm meant to do this? I'm not even seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing, you know? But being the wonderful person that she was like, let's figure out what you're seeing and why. Like, there's a reason. Because all I was seeing was bones, you know? And I would tune into somebody and I would be like, I see bones, but this bone is missing, and this bone looks like it's metal, and this bone looks like a butterfly now. And, you know, like, it was just all very cryptic feeling. And that kind of put me on this journey of working with other people to develop my intuition. I mean, I worked for years just volunteering to do readings for people in Facebook groups that I was a part of, you know, to be like, let me understand what it is that I'm seeing. And it finally got to the point that I started noticing the pattern. I'm a pattern person. So I started noticing every time I'm with someone's shoulder blades, this is sort of like an inner child theme that's coming up. And every time I'm with the sternum, we're looking at really deep core wounds that require softness and tenderness and vulnerability. And every time I'm in the pelvis, it's always a generational thing. And so I just started kind of putting these patterns together and looking at how they actually all flow through the skeleton in our body, and how they connect and how they move together. And that kind of became really the first realm of the realms of embodiment. And so the way I look at energy is what I call energy archaeology. It's that digging in, letting the body tell us the story of what's there.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I love the terminology that you use too, energy archaeology. My husband's trained as an archaeologist. He now works as a web developer. Well, he's actually more in management level now, so not doing as much of the developing himself. But he has a PhD in archaeology. And so when I showed him the deck, he's like, energy archaeology. He's like, what's that? And I said, well, I think my understanding, and I think this is what you just articulated, is that it's digging deep into your bones. It's like excavating all of the stuff that is built up in our bodies over time, right? But I love that terminology because it's a sense of exploration and digging deep, right? And that's so fascinating to me. And just the patterns. And I love, because I think there's a section in here where you talk about the energy flow through the body too. Like there's a sequencing of how the energy moves through different areas of the body, through different skeletal systems. And I loved looking at that because there is such a flow in our bodies of energy, right? And it's so fascinating to see what direction that goes in. And another component that I love about the system, I want to go back to what you were just saying, but I also wanted to explore the idea of elements that you used here, because every bone is corresponding with either earth, air, water, or fire, right? And I love that because it's such a component of tarot as well, right? That's the primary system that I use, but I love that there's this cross correlation with body systems and different practices. And yeah, so how did you determine what those associations would be? Was that an intuitive thing? Was that something that you cross-referenced with another modality? Like, how did that come to be?
Yeah, so that was something. So I'll back up for a minute here, because whenever I start talking about the bones and anatomy and all of that, I think it's really important to understand that I don't actually have a formal training in anatomy. Like, I have a formal training in environmental science and ecology, and like that was kind of the path that I took. I wasn't even really interested in anatomy until that was all I could see in the body was bones. And I would be working with people in a session and I would hear a bone name and I would say that, and I would say, this is what it's saying. Like, this is what it's showing me. It's sort of like playing out this movie of this thing. And I would get off of that call and go look up and make sure that that was actually a bone name. Like, I would be like, oh, the highway does exist, you know, like that's what it is. So all of my anatomy training is so intuitive, spirit led. like what comes in when I'm working with people, what the body tells me about itself. And then I have since started filling that in with taking anatomy training, learning anatomy on my own, reading like scientific journals, medicine journals, stuff like that.
Well,
So
you
if
have a
you,
diagram here too, which is super helpful for reference. Like my anatomy is based in like high school biology years and years ago, and
yes,
then I did yoga training over the years ago as well. Before I got disillusioned with how appropriative that particular industry is, and had to kind of take a step back. But it was so interesting to cross-reference that again and look at all the different systems of the body. And I love that you included all the key words along with it. So it's really easy to kind of source that through the book. Anyway, sorry for
good.
interrupting. I want to hear what you were saying. Yeah.
No, I'm glad you enjoy that. Because I was like, I want a way to make these actually make sense, you know.
Mhm.
So as we're organizing the table of contents, and I was like, let's do a visual one.
I love
Um, yeah, but the elements in the bones were something that came up again through noticing pattern and noticing how energy was flowing in a specific way in that bone.
it.
So in what I call water bones, which tend to be a lot of our peripheral bones, actually tend to be sort of like everything flowing in the legs and the
Yeah.
arms, really in the skull and kind of coming down into the core part of the skeleton. Most of those are water bones. And what I mean by that is their job energetically is
Mhm.
to flow energy. It's to and I think about this also from like an ecological sense, but also in tarot I think it's kind of a very similar thing. Where whenever something is flowing at a specific rate, it will keep things in flow, right? Like if you have water that's flowing at a specific rate, there are solutes and other dissolved like organic matter that will kind of stay in flow with it. Whenever we allow that flow to slow down and we really start to work with that bone and we kind of pause, that's when everything we've been keeping in flow, kind of in that foundational part of our skeleton, starts to settle out and we start to be able to look at it and we start to be able to like, what do we do with this thing? Like we start to understand what it is we're actually passing along like over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That's like not really getting checked. That's not that we're not even understanding or carrying.
Yeah.
Um, and then that's where some of the other pieces come into play. So air isn't really a bone. There's like a few of them, but mainly that's our joints, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like those are like our little, they're not really air pockets, but those are the places where we kind of pause and get a little analytical. Like it's that checkpoint.
Yeah.
I always call it an algorithm. So it's kind of this process of like, wait a minute, is what's flowing through actually what the next bone wants to receive?
Yeah.
Because it's that continuing like building system. So if we're coming in our hands, say, and we kind of come here where we check in with like universal timing and pulse, and then in co-creation, and then integration, and then we move into the core of our body. Um, you know, that wrist joint is checking like, are the frequencies that are flowing in the hand like that that air analytical space is saying, but wait a minute, is this happening in divine
Yeah.
timing? I'm checking this against, is this something we're actually prepared to co-create with?
Yeah.
Like it's kind of referencing like what it's moving into next and if we're ready for that thing, if we can actually carry it in. Fire bones help us to transmute. So we have very few of those, but they kind of sit at like the confluence of almost where there's all the other ones kind of coming together because those are transmuting, right? Those are, it's like fire and tarot. It's like there's a very similar correspondence, right? The elements always kind of do the
Absolutely.
same thing alchemically in tarot in other systems. So it's looking at things that have continued to be brought through either through water that air has continued to kind of like check and say okay for, but like once it gets to a certain buildup, a certain point, like we've been carrying it for so long, that feeling of heaviness, that feeling
Mhm.
of like I just need to like burn this down, burn it off, this is going to turn into something better for me.
Yeah.
That's what our fire bones do. They
Yeah,
kind
that's fascinating.
they kind of take over that role and responsibility. And so one of them is the sphenoid that kind of runs
Mhm.
like in the head. It's like a little bat or butterfly shaped bone that runs in the skull. The ischium bones in the pelvis, they're one of our fire bones. Um, and then the last one are the earth bones. And they get kind of a bad rap because every time I work with somebody with like an earth bone heavy thing, it's always because it's been repressed and generational and very heavy and stuck and just feels, you know, like it's going to take so much work to excavate this thing.
Yeah.
But when our earth bones are actually working for us, they're composting. Like it's a long process, but they're actually turning it into something nutritive that we can use. So they kind of have this little bit of like feeling of stuckness, heaviness, density,
Yeah.
but what they're really doing is like kind of using everything that has been brought in. And earth bones are the sternum, so the core wound stuff. They're our shoulder blades that are inner child
Mhm.
stuff. They're the pubic bones, which are things we've inherited. Like they're the really like the things like that we can get maybe hesitant. I mean, I hate to use the term, but there are shadow work bones, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's
Like
so
that's
interesting. Like, yeah, I pulled this why and I tend to carry a lot in my shoulders, and the fact that you just mentioned inner child work, like that's something that I'm actively working to rehabilitate. So it's fascinating to me that all that tension is kind of trapped there, right? It makes so much sense because those are like the heavier bones, right? And like Earth, it makes sense. If you correspond with like Taurus, there's a sense of fixedness and stubbornness that's often determination I like to look at that's associated with that sign. And there's a strength to that, but there's also resistance. So it's like working with that to try and find some ease in that space. That's fascinating. I just noticed that someone had a really interesting question here. Can the cards in the deck be combined and used to create the entire skeleton body for healing work and other magical workings?
They can be. There
Yeah.
are some cards where I have grouped them. So the radius and ulna and the tibia and fibula are on the same card.
Oh,
So
fabulous.
that one is a little bit tricky if you were trying to like build out the skeleton. And then there are ones like there is a pelvis card, and then there is an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis, right? So like there's
Yeah.
the pelvis on its own, and then all of the kind of independent bones that then fuse to make the pelvis.
Yeah.
So there's a couple places where it can be a little bit strange, but there is a left hand, there's a right hand, there's a left foot,
Mhm.
there's a right foot. Humerus and femurs are on the same card because they're integrating
Mhm.
bones.
Yeah.
So there's a few places where you wouldn't be able to like lay it out and kind of map, you know, like the skeleton itself. But there is part of the guidebook where I actually recommend, like, if you've been working with a part of your body significantly for a while, or if you're really curious about it, like lay out the entire like arm in its order and really look at what is the message altogether. You know, like what does it look like whenever I put all five fingers and the wrist and the co-creating card for the radius and ulna and the elbow and the humerus? Like, what is this telling me as it's coming up this system of bones?
Yeah.
um, and it's really interesting to study them like that because the bigger picture can oftentimes weave the story together in a more complete way than just looking at one card can.
Absolutely. I mean, all of the systems working together and integrating different things, that's such a big part of the healing process. I feel it's not just about that one thing that has gone a bit wonky. It's like how that relates to everything in that area and the body system as a whole, right? So that's fascinating. One thing I wanted to ask you about too is what if you have a broken bone or some kind of dysfunction in a bone in your body? Like, what would be the best way to kind of approach that or work with that? Or even like if something happened historically, yeah, like how would you approach that?
Yeah, so okay, so we'll start with something that I kind of speak to whenever I teach programs where I'm working with somebody specifically that maybe does not have access to a part of their body or physically does not have that part of their body. I've worked with people who are amputees before or have had like spinal fusions or rods put into their back. And in that case, essentially we work with the energy as if it exists there because the energy does still exist. We can still tap into that part of the body,
Yeah.
even if that physical part of the body is not with us any longer. So there
Mhm.
is like a physical incarnated thing that kind of holds the energy in place, right? Like it actually runs through the bones, through the marrow, the crystalline structure, etc. But we can still access it if we do not have that part of the body physically with us. We're not born with it, it has been removed, etc. um, Broken bones are really interesting, in that typically they actually heal, well, I can't say they actually heal, they can heal stronger than they were to begin with. Every
Mm-hmm.
time I've worked with someone who has had a broken bone, um, like like that we're working and a bone is broken, or that like it has happened in like a very specific way in the past, or it's like been an accident that was really kind of top of mind for them, there has always been a correlation to the bone that has broken and what they were traversing at that point in their life. Even if it seems totally random, like I broke both femurs in a skiing accident or something,
Yeah.
we will start talking about what those bones are saying, and they'll be like, oh my God, that's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
You know, that oftentimes whenever we're working with a broken bone, we are dealing with a part of our foundation that will like refuses to continue, basically, right? Like, and this tends to happen when we continue to override that system. If we're not letting our bones really do their innate job of like moving energy through and sorting it out and like changing with it, like if we really dig in and we are stuck, um sort of, I don't want to say like play acting, but like we feel like we have to kind of move in these same sort of inherited generational, societal, cultural, foundational things that we were born into,
Mm-hmm.
but we are meant to actually move away from them, out of them, whatever. If we kind of refuse to make that shift, oftentimes our bones will, like, there will be a really big reset.
Yeah.
And that does tend to happen when I see people with broken bones. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what's happening.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, that's so interesting. I got my first broken bone ever. I rolled my foot and broke a bone on the outside of my right foot in like May of 2020, and it slowed me right down. And it was so necessary to have that pause at that point. And I was looking up the um the meaning, and it, yeah, right foot is activating, right? It's that whole like forward momentum and like forced pause and forced stop and reflection and all of that. It was really interesting. Anytime I look at systems of the body and corresponding themes and ideas, there's always a connection, and it's fascinating to me, often in hindsight, to look back, because at the time it's maybe not so clear, but then, you know, they say, what is it, hindsight's 2020. Like it's fascinating what you can pick up even looking back at it. So yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. So if someone is, oh yeah, there was a quote that you had in the book that I thought was absolutely fascinating, or maybe it was on the back. Working with the cards and with your bones brings you into conversation with parts of yourself that have been calling out for attention, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. I love the idea of that. Like we look at genetics and DNA and physical conditions that are passed down in the body, right? Whether it's a propensity to certain illnesses or, you know, genetic things that run through the family, but then there's this whole idea of intergenerational trauma and the emotional things that get passed down through generations. And I wanted to get your ideas on that, because I love what you said about things being passed down not just for years within your own body, but for generations, and like how that can show up in your body, and the possibility of facilitating healing not just for yourself, but like through the family line as well. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the bones, whenever we're talking about things that have been passed down for generations, we're usually talking about foundational themes, trauma being one of them. There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of generational trauma, especially whenever we feel into the pelvis, because that's where this ancestral stuff, this inherited
Yeah.
energy, all wants to enter our body from a bone perspective. And I'll kind of zoom out a little bit. This was one of the things that took me a minute to understand whenever I was starting to work with the bones, was whenever I would just kind of tune into someone's pelvic bones, and whenever you're learning a system, I don't know if you've noticed this before, but themes will group together. And like I had a couple months where the only people coming to see me were all pelvic issues. Like
Oh,
it was all pelvis stuff that was coming up. And it was this really deep dive into looking at like what I see, what I'm maybe able to access when we drop into the pelvis. And what that is what I call the ancestral plane. And so it kind of
mm-hmm.
makes sense from like inheritance birthing perspective also, that this kind of sits at the pelvis. But
Mm-hmm.
what it looks like to me is tree rings. that
Oh,
come out.
yeah.
They kind of, it's almost like they kind of hover around the pelvic bones whenever I tune in. And they can, it's like whenever I will kind of reach out and want to like touch like what's out in this sort of ancestral plane, is it's like this first little ring is, and this is like, even if they're still alive, it's like the first ring is sort of in like a space where your parents' energy is connected,
Mhm.
and then it's grandparents, great grandparents, great great grandparents, etc., all the way out. And of course we have more ancestors at every ring as we go, and it just kind of ends up looking like this star field, which is really beautiful.
Yeah.
um, but what I have noticed is that there will be certain rings that would be like really dim and kind of like they had sunken down, and other ones would be really bright, or they'd be kind of lopsided. Or if someone is like, part of what's been going on with their pelvis is like they have been open to working with inherited energies, like you know how we'll kind of get this feeling that it's like this is my thing to resolve.
Mhm.
It's almost like the ancestral plane and the ancestors get that message, and it like bunches up really tight, like there's like kind of like a run in the pantyhose, and like it
Yeah.
pulls it all in. And then it can feel like a lot of pressure, and we can feel pain, and like a hip will start hurting, or our sacrum feels like it's never in place because there's just this rush of energy that is like has nowhere to go because the rest of our
Mhm.
body can't actually work it out that fast, right? But it's like
Yeah.
we kind of give this signal that it's like, all right, I'm ready to work this thing out, and they're like, yes, you know, and like all of the energy starts flooding in. um and so we can kind of work with that energy actually out in the ancestral plane in a way that it doesn't actually have to come into our body and be worked out physically through us in that
Mhm.
way. But really, anytime I would work with somebody and we would have, you know, like ischium issues or pubic bone pain, or a lot of like pubic symphysis, especially that happens during pregnancy, and like that starts splitting apart and we kind of feel that
Mhm.
pain at that joint.
Mhm.
There's like it's almost like a lot of energies kind of coming in from the ancestral plane, like during that gestation period.
Yeah.
um, uh, Anytime we're working with like a sacrum feeling like it's out of place all the time, so there's those joints on both sides of the sacrum where the ilium comes in, it's kind of this feeling of like misfitting or not belonging or not wanting to belong is a really key thing. Or like it's sort of this like rejection of what has been coming in through the ilium, so that's where the ancestral energies come in. It kind of comes over that crest. um, and there will almost be like this self-awareness where the bone body will be like, I don't want to receive all of that, and so the sacrum can kind of try to set itself apart, right? And so those joints aren't lining up correctly. um, and it's just this, I don't know how to wrap this up succinctly, but it's this really interesting thing where we have free will. Maybe this is
Mhm.
where I'll go with this, right? So
Mhm.
I feel like oftentimes there's this dialogue that if you are here to clear up inherited stuff or whatever, that you don't have a choice